Okay, welcome tonight. It's 7 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started with our question and answer tonight. We've had a good week. I've been editing my book most of the week. It's been really cold, and so it's a good time to stay inside and to read and write. That's what we call the farmer cycle. Is in the summer we do lots of work. We're up at dawn. We go to bed after dark. And in the winter time, we pretty much do the same thing. We get up and we go to bed way after dark, but we do a lot of reading and studying and learning. And I learned that from the example of the founding fathers of the United States. That's kind of what they did. And as you study history, a lot of civilizations have done that. But anyway, so it's been fun to be able to do that. And so right now I'm editing my book, and I've been writing an online class so that we can get more of this good information out to other people. So let's go ahead, and I like to put this up here so everybody can see what I'm doing, the way I'm helping the world to grow food. I have my YouTube channel. I have my free Q&A. That's what this is, every Thursday night. I have my Patreon account, and it's I've been putting out 5 to 6 videos a day for last week or so, and so that's been fun. There's a lot to talk about in the winter time that's happening in the solar greenhouse, growing food in there. And I have my 17-week course that I teach, and we announced last week that I have an online option for that 17-week course. So that's pretty exciting that we're able to do that for people who can't actually come here for a full growing season. And that's why it's 17 weeks, is it's a growing season, or a short growing season. So I'm a soil laboratory, so I can test your soil, and I do consulting for people who are starting farms. And I do my boot camp a couple of times a year. We have one coming up in January. So tell all your friends and family about that, and you can come learn how to grow food in the middle of the winter inside of a greenhouse. And my book is almost done. Hopefully it'll be done, and hopefully soon, like a couple of months, and we get that released. So tonight's exciting topic is planning for your garden. And I don't like elaborate plans. I like to keep things simple. If you get too excited and make it too complicated, it takes the fun out of it. But when you're planning to feed yourself from your own garden, if you want to eat a lot of food, so you have a varied diet, which we should be eating a lot of different kinds of food, then it does become complicated. It simply is complicated because of the sheer types of things you could be growing. Like in my seed closet right now, I have over 300 varieties of food that we can grow in the garden. And so that's a lot. And so just by that number, things get complicated. But that's why planning is so important, because when we plan and we have a simple way to plan, then it makes a complicated thing manageable, and we need to be able to manage it. So here's how I plan my garden. I simply want to grow enough food to feed my family. So I take out a sheet of paper, just going to point right here with my cursor. So I take out a sheet of paper, and I have one sheet of paper for each crop. And so if I'm doing 20 different crops in a year, I'll have one sheet of paper for each one. And then I will fill out on that one piece of paper what is happening with that crop. Because if you try to do this in a notebook and you start putting multiple crops on multiple pages, it becomes really confusing. Even if you're using a computer, it becomes really confusing. So I like to have one page for each food. And I like to think in volumes and not pounds. A lot of times when we buy food, it's a lot about the pounds, because we buy foods in pounds. Just a lot of things are dealt with in pounds. But when it comes to our memory of how much food do I actually eat during the year, we don't think in pounds. I don't know anybody who thinks in pounds. Well, I might, but they haven't told me they think in pounds. People think in volume. Volume means like a quart. So do I eat a quart of pickles once a month, or do I go through 3 or 4 quarts of pickles once a month? And people can answer that question. If I say, how many pounds of tomatoes do you eat in a year? Nobody can answer that because nobody thinks that way. But if I say, how many containers of salsa do you eat in a year? And and in a year, people are still confused. But if you say once a month, how many containers of salsa do you go through? And they'll say, oh, maybe 2. And so people think in volume. That's just what I've learned over the years when I talk about gardening with people. So when we buy food, a lot of times it's in pounds. But when we are making our plan, it's a lot easier if we think in volume. It's just easier to figure it out that way. So what I do, if you need the basics of how much a food will produce, you can just go to Google and you say, how many pounds of green beans makes a quart? And Google will give you those answers. And you can read and you can get basic answers. Now, those answers are going to change depending on how your garden yields, depending on your soil, depending on fertilizer, depending on climate. There's a lot of, I mean, a cow could come into your garden, eat all your plants, and then you don't get anything. So there's a lot of climatic and environmental variables that we're dealing with. But basically, you can figure on a place to start by going to Google and asking. All right. And then you would need to ask that about each vegetable specifically. So if we go over to this other side right over here, where I'm flipping my cursor around here, on the paper, you're going to fill out these 4 questions. What are you eating? How much do you eat in quarts or freezer bags or whatever volume you put food up in? And then how much did you grow last year? Because that's going to help you to adjust for this year. And then how much to grow this year to meet your demand. And so I've made several slides here to help us understand what in the world I'm talking about, because this looks confusing right now. But it's the easiest way I've ever found to plan on actually feeding your family. So here's peaches. Selena put these peaches up. We got them from Utah. Selena's my neighbor. And she shared these with me. These are in my pantry. I just took this picture today. And we've been eating these. They're super yummy. And I probably go through 2 of these things of peaches every month. So how many do I need for a year? Well, 12 months in a year, and I do eat 2 a month. So 2 times 12 is 24. So I need 24. But pounds of peaches, I can't tell you the pounds because I don't think in pounds. But I know how in volume, how much it is. So that's why I keep talking about volume. So here's the pickle page. So over here on the left side of the page is the formula I gave you a second ago. What do you eat? And then the answer's right here in red, pickles. I eat pickles, but I don't grow pickles in the garden. I grow cucumbers, and then we make pickles out of them. So what do you eat? Pickles, but I wrote down cucumbers for clarification. And then how much do I eat in quarts? Well, I eat about 2 quarts of pickles a month. That's what my family goes through. If it was just me, it'd be a little bit less. But me and my wife and my kids, we go through about 2 quarts a month. If you're feeding a family of 10, or if you're feeding an army of 200, you're going to have to adjust this and do the math. But I know what I eat in volume. It's about 2 quarts a month. And so I need 24 quarts a year. Well, how did I do this year? So right here, how much did I grow last year in my garden, this last growing season? Well, I planted 30 plants and it gave me 12 quarts. So did I grow enough? If I eat 24 quarts and I only got 12, well, I'm going to be running out of pickles, and then I have to buy them from the store, or I just don't eat them, or whatever. And so I needed to plant twice as many plants with the growing conditions that I had this year, and I can assume that my growing conditions will be similar this next growing season. So I need to plant twice as many plants. So I need to extend my garden, and I have to have 60 plants. So this is just kind of how you do the math. It's pretty simple. But it can get a lot more complicated than this. And I have a couple of other slides that show that. But we need to think about what happens in the real world. Because how many cucumbers am I going to eat fresh? How many cucumbers am I going to give away to my neighbor? how many cucumbers am I going to sell at the farmer's market? So there's a lot more in this math problem than what you see right here. But this gives us a very simple way to adjust from what I did last year and what I am doing this year. So there's my peaches again. Okay, here we go. Now, when I go to Google and I say, Google, how many green beans does it take to fill up a quart? It says about 2 pounds. Okay, so so if I've never grown green beans before, and I don't know, because if I'm a new gardener, I deal with a lot of people who are starting out new, and I help a lot of people get their gardens going for the first couple of years, or maybe they gardened when they were a kid and they worked for 20 years and now they want to get back into gardening, so they don't have all this stuff in their head. And so that's why I built this way, so we can think about it. So just say to Google, how many green beans does it take to fill up a quart? And green beans will say it takes 2 pounds of green beans. Well, I don't know what that means. And so I did another Google search that said, how many pounds will a green bean plant produce? And then it tells me that a bush bean will give you 1/2 pound per plant, and a pole bean will give you 1 pound per plant. So just by being creative and clear with Google, it will start bringing up answers for you. Now, are these answers accurate? No, they're not accurate, but they get you in the ballpark of starting to garden. They do get you in the ballpark, because maybe you thought that one plant would give you 50 pounds, and it's not gonna. So this at least gets you in the ballpark to get going. So anyway, so there's that, but let's just go through this formula again. So what do you eat? And I wrote down green beans. How much do you eat in quarts? We're thinking in volume again. And I know that I go through about 2 quarts of green beans a month. So I need about 24 bottles in a year. That's what my family consumes. So I'm thinking, okay, that's great. So what did I do this year? Well, I planted 100 bush beans and I planted 50 pole beans. And what did I end up with? I ended up with 12 quarts. I actually ate a lot of them because I like to put them on a cookie sheet. You put some olive oil on them, put them in the oven, and you bake them till they're tender. They're super good. They're like candy. And so we would eat a lot of them. So I didn't have enough to produce my 24 quarts. So I only have half as much this year as what I wanted to produce. So let's just go to the bottom of the screen here and look at what I wrote in red. In the real world, sometimes you need to grow 3 to 4 times as many of whatever food it is, so you have enough ripe at the same time to do a batch all at once. Now, this is absolutely true with green beans. It's absolutely true with tomatoes. They don't all ripen at once. So if you think, well, I only need 2 quarts of green beans, and so I only need to plant a few plants, and it's going to be cool. Well, you are not going to have enough at one time to harvest to fill up a quart jar, because they blossom and you get 3 or 4 beans per plant at one time. And so you need a whole bunch of green beans growing at the same time to get enough volume to fill up a quart jar. And so if you're wanting to do a full batch, a lot of home canners fill up like 8 jars in a canner. So if you want to do a full batch, you need to plant a whole bunch. So in order to adjust this, I just put this number in red. I need to be planting 200 pole beans next year, because pole beans produce more than bush beans, and I need to be planting 100 bush beans. So I'm planting 4 times as many pole beans this next year as I did last year. By the way, these are not real numbers of what I planted, but these are good hypotheticals to think about on a home gardening size. Let's go to the next one here. So what are we eating? So here's the same formula that we're going to do on a blank page for everything we eat. So what do we eat? Well, I like beets, and I like pickled beets. They're fun. They make a good salad dressing. They're a fun thing to eat. I like to eat them plain. They're super nutritious. And there's a lot of different recipes you can use for pickled beets. You can make them more spicy. You can make them more sweet. There's fun things you can do with beets. So how many quarts do I need? So again, we're thinking volume. Well, I go through, and this is a true number. Our family goes through about 1 quart a month. So I need about 12 quarts a year. That's not very many beets to grow. And so how much did I grow this last year? I planted 84 plants, and that gave me 12 quarts, so it came out perfect. And I just ran some math on my calculator to come up with these. I actually grew probably 8,400 beet plants this year because I grow a lot of them just for the soil, for soil health purposes, because they have a beautiful taproot that goes down in the soil and feeds the microlife. But anyway, I didn't know when I was preparing this slide, I'm like thinking, I don't even know how many beets go into a bottle. Like 2 large beets, you can cut those up and that's probably a quart, like the great big ones, you know. So I just Googled it and it said that 7 medium-sized beets fill a quart. And I was like, okay, I'm telling people to get on Google, so I'll go with that. And then I ran the numbers of 7 beets. And so if you grow 84 of these, it's going to do this. But there's a big caveat to this. There's a big problem. Because I've grown beets for my entire life. There's only been 4 or 5 years when I haven't grown beets since I started gardening full time at 12 years old. And so in the real world, not all beets grow into a harvestable size beet. So we're going to need to double this number to get our 12 quarts. And so when we double our 84 plants, that's 170 plants. So just round it up to 200 to make sure you're actually getting your 12 quarts. And a lot of plants are this way. They don't produce as much as we think they will. So if we're going to make a mistake on growing too much. That way we're not hungry and we don't have famines in the land. Okay, here's the next one, tomatoes. So tomatoes can be trickier because there's all kinds of different tomatoes. But let's just go through the formula real quick again. So what do we eat? I write down tomatoes. How much do I eat in volume? Well, I'm going to eat 2 quarts a month, which is 24 quarts a year. And for me, that would be low. If all the tomatoes I consume, it's probably more like 4 quarts a month for my family. We like to make salsa. We like to make spaghetti sauce. We like to make other types of things out of tomatoes, like chili sauces and ketchups and all kinds of fun things. But just get the tomatoes canned, you can open a can of tomatoes and you can use it in dozens and dozens of recipes. So it's fun to just have a lot of tomatoes that are ready to go for the kitchen. So how much did you grow last year? Well, 10 plants. Of course, here again, this is a hypothetical, more like a normal person-sized garden. So 10 plants, and I'm thinking of people I've worked with over the years, and this is the kind of stuff they tell me. I grew 10 plants. I needed 24 quarts, but I only got 5 quarts. I say, how come? Did your plants not grow? No, they grew great. We had so many tomatoes, so I had to give a lot away. So instead of canning tomatoes, they were giving them away. And they said, well, I never had enough at once to can. That only happened one time. And that's when I got my 5 quarts that I did. And that's part of the problem with not having enough plants at once. Growing, you don't get enough at once to do your home canning. So I put small numbers in here so we can talk about that kind of thing. So, so from this 10 plants, you probably need to bump it up to 120. If you're the kind of person who's going to give away tomatoes and you're going to eat a lot of fresh tomatoes, you're making fresh salsas and fresh this and fresh that, and you need a lot of plants to produce a lot of food. Okay. So just remember down here, in the real world, if you're eating a lot of fresh foods, especially the fruits, you need to compensate and bump your number way up so that you get enough quarts. Now, I think average tomatoes, if you have really good soil, your tomatoes are going to be averaging somewhere 8 to 9 pounds from one plant. Some years I can figure on a 10-pound yield from a plant, but that's a tomato plant that's doing pretty good, you know. And so you could average 5 pounds and you'll have extra, but you kind of need to figure. But so with a 9-pound figure, then you can figure that one plant is going to give you 3 quarts. It's kind of how the math works out on this, which is fun, you know. So that's pretty exciting. So I bumped this up to 120, but that's just from looking at this. If you actually wanted 24 quarts, you're bumping it up to 120 to get 24 quarts. Something's totally wrong with the math here. So what this is saying is that you're giving an amazing amount of away down here to friends and neighbors. Because I did this math problem here. If you want 24 quarts, right here where my cursor is, and it's 3 pounds per quart, then you're going to be having 72 pounds of food in those 24 quarts. And so that's only 8 plants if you're averaging 9 pounds per plant. So if you're only getting 5 pounds a plant, you're going to need more plants. But this kind of helps you to start to think how it's working. So you always want to look at this this middle figure here. How much did you grow last year? Because this is going to be one of the indicators on every single food that you grow that helps you understand how to adjust for next year. Because it doesn't matter what the internet tells you. It doesn't matter what I tell you or any other successful gardener tells you. If your plants don't perform the same way in your soil and your gardening methods as another person's, then all of this advice we're giving you is going to be wrong. So you need to be keeping track of how much you're producing with your conditions, because that's the biggest factor that's going to help you know how many plants to be growing so that you can get the volume of food you need so that your family is well fed throughout the year. Okay, let's see if I can go to the next slide here. So that's the end of the short presentation for tonight on how I plan to have plenty of food. Now, I only have those few examples. I'll just flip through them again. There's the tomato example, the pickled beets example, the green bean example, and the cucumber example for pickles. But you need to do this for every food that you grow. You know, or you wanting to dehydrate tomatoes, well, you would need to figure that out, and you need to figure out how many tomatoes it takes to fill up, you know, a freezer bag of dried tomatoes, and you can ask that on Google to get you in the ballpark to get started. And then after doing this for 2 or 3 years, you're going to be really good at it. But every plant that you grow needs its own sheet like this, so that you can have a plan of what you're doing. And you can obviously do it on a computer. You could do it on a spreadsheet. You could do it on just actual pencil and paper. But don't try to do it on one page for multiple crops, because it becomes very confusing. Tackle each crop at a time. And so I'm going to open this up for questions now. I did receive a few questions, and I wrote them in the next slide. So those of you who are on live, we will go to your questions first. We'll answer your questions. And I just want to remind you about Winter Boot Camp. It's coming up January 19, 2021. And that's next month. It's coming up very quickly. So if you want to come to boot camp, I will be teaching you how to grow food in the middle of the winter inside of a greenhouse. If you've already been to boot camp before, this is a similar class, but we are focusing on the winter growing. And so if you are confident that you don't need, or what I mean is if you're confident you can grow enough food for your family, then you probably don't need this class. Otherwise, come to this class and sharpen your skills. And of course, our 17-week course is ready to go. and that starts in May, but go to www.georgicrevolution.com and you can see all of this stuff there and you can get signed up.
And for those of you listening to the recording of this, William misspoke. It's January 2023, not 2021.
Yes. I think what I was trying to say was the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st. But who knows what came out of my mouth. Thank you, Ezekiel, for keeping me straight. That's why I have you on here. So thank you very much. Okay. Who has questions? Go ahead and unmute and ask your question, or you can type into the chat and I will answer your questions.
What about corn? That's a weird one because you don't get very many per stalk.
So are you wanting me to go through a mathematical calculation and tell you about corn? Is that what you're asking?
I was just curious about corn, and I'm also curious about sauerkraut. Like, you know.
Okay, so I get this question all the time. I'm so glad you asked this, Melanie. This is really good because I get this question like lots. People often say, how many plants do I need to plant to feed myself? And I can't answer that. There's no way I can answer it. So I'm going to throw that question back at you, Melanie, just the way I throw it back to everybody else. And I'm going to say, how much corn does your family eat every month in volume?
If we had it, I don't know.
Would you eat a quart of corn?
And then do we want it?
Once a month? So that's what you have to do. You have to figure it out. You have to think about your menu. And then you plant according to your menu. See, I've had people in the past say, I'm never going to garden again because all I ever get is bushels of tomatoes. And I don't know what to do with them. I end up throwing them away and it makes me feel guilty. And I said, well, so you're getting more than you eat. Oh, we get 100 times more than we can eat. And I say, why did you plant so many? And the response is usually their jaw drops a little bit. They look away from me and break contact. They don't know how to answer that. Well, I thought we were supposed to plant a big garden. No, you're not supposed to plant a big garden. You're supposed to produce the food your family eats. That's the purpose of a garden. So that's why I come up with a little formula. I'll just go back to that here on the, just right here, what do you eat? You have to know what you eat, and you have to know what you eat in volume. So you asked me, what about corn? Let's just go through this. Let's say that you eat 2 quarts of corn a month. So that's 24 quarts a year. So how much did you grow last year? So that's a real question. Melanie, how much corn did you grow last year?
1 stalk after they all didn't grow.
Okay, that's pretty good. Good for you. So did you get an ear of corn off of it?
No, we're saving what little seeds we got for popcorn. Because that's the one it is. It's popcorn.
Okay.
Giant popcorn.
So as far as eating corn, you didn't get any. Because I assumed you were talking about corn you would eat with mashed potatoes.
Well, we tried that too, but
yeah. Okay, so 0. So you grew 0 corn. So you need to sharpen your skills on corn growing because what you grew was 0 and you needed 24 quarts. So you're going to write down how much did you grow. You're going to write down 0, but to get 24 quarts of corn, you're going to need to plant a block and you're going to have 6 rows that are 10 feet long, and you're going to put a corn seed in the ground every foot in those rows.
Oh, every foot.
Every foot. 1 seed every foot. You could go every 2 feet, but every foot. And then you're going to, when the corn gets about 2 feet tall, you're going to plant a bunch of other things in it, like turnips, rutabagas, beets, chard, lettuce, and you're going to make it look like a gigantic weed patch so that you get 4 plant families growing together, and that will turn on the, I should have you guys teach this. You've heard it 100 times now. It'll turn on the secondary metabolites because you have grown an amazing amount of beneficial soil microbes in the soil, and that will keep your disease and your pests away. At least it will help. It may not keep it away 100%, but it's a lot better than having a monocrop.
With that, if you're planting them a foot apart, how far apart are your rows? If you're
3
planting
feet.
Oh, okay, so you do have room then in between to plant
Yes, you do.
all of that, like even zucchini, so it can climb up the corn. Three
Yeah,
systems.
I probably wouldn't plant zucchini, but the cucurbits is a good family to have in there. I would rather plant cantaloupe or
Oh,
a cucumber, something that stays low to the ground. Zucchinis get a little bit too tall and they want a little bit more too light. So the zucchinis wouldn't do too good. And the leaves are so big, they crowd out the light on the ground of the other plants you're trying to grow.
Okay, so maybe one area of your rows you could plant zucchini. I'm thinking,
Yeah, you can certainly put 1 or 2 zucchini plants in that patch.
yeah, okay. If we like corn.
Yeah, and so at the end of the year, pick your corn and put it in and freeze it in quart bags or can it, whatever you're going to do, dehydrate it, and then see if that was enough for your year. And then the next year you're going to know.
Okay. Cabbage is such a hard thing for us to grow. We've never been really successful with it. So it's hard to know how much you're going to get per quart from a cabbage for making coleslaw, for instance.
Yeah, so there's a variety called
Not coleslaw, sorry, sauerkraut.
Yeah, right, yeah. So there's a variety of cabbage called Megaton, and I grew one of those 2 years ago, and it was 27 pounds when I picked it.
Whoa.
And so if you grew one of those, what you would want to do is say how many, you would go to Google and you would say, how many pounds of cabbage make a quart? And it'll come up and it'll get you in the ballpark. And then you can say, oh, so I need 3 megaton cabbages to give me 20 quarts. Or if you grew another variety of cabbage called Early Jersey Wakefield, those are cute little 2.5 to 3 pound heads. And so you're like one cabbage is going to fill a quart. So you're going to need to grow 24 of those to get your 24 quarts of cabbage. And don't write this down. I'm just talking off the top of my head. I mean, you're going to have to go to Google to get you in the ballpark. I have no idea if I'm in the ballpark. I grow this stuff. I don't do a lot of canning.
Your wife does.
There are a lot of people close to me who do, and they should be teaching this class. Okay. Anybody else have a question?
I have a quick question. So I think figuring out what we actually eat is really, really difficult because generally I feel like we don't eat a lot of fresh vegetables as much as we'd like to. Just with our living situation, we generally aren't cooking for ourselves. We want to move towards doing that more. Do you have any particular resources or recommendations on figuring out like how much food makes different meals? Like, I know that's a weird question, but maybe you know somewhere somebody could look if they were interested in such things.
The quick answer is no, I don't. And I'm sorry about that. I'll bet you there's some really great books out there that are gardening books that are all about the end of gardening when you come to your harvest. I mean, a lot of the books that I read when I was a kid, they would talk about harvest and all that kind of stuff, but no, I'm sorry. I don't have a good answer for that. Let me look at the chat here and see what we've got. Okay, we have a question here in the chat. I'm going to read it. So Alan asks, my brother farms using several 120-acre pivots in rural Utah and says he tills his cornfields after every harvest because they harvest it with choppers and semi-trucks and it compacts the ground. They also go through hundreds of gallons of nitrogen throughout the year. What would you do first to improve the soil quality? Would you recommend a winter cover crop or a different harvesting method? Okay, great question. Awesome question. Thank you for asking. When you're doing large agriculture, the principles of soil health are the very same as if we're talking about a 10 square foot garden box on your deck, on your high-rise apartment building. Soil health principles are always the same. So you're concerned about compacting the ground. Sometimes in large agriculture, the ground does get compacted because the crop is ready. You have to get it out. It has to go to market, or else you don't have a business. You lose your farm. So sometimes you just have to do that. It's not the most ideal situation, but yes, you're on the right track. Cover crops are the very best thing in the world. I would absolutely plant the cover crops. What I would do, and if I wouldn't do it to a big pivot all at once. You want to do it to a part of a pivot, just one, like make one strip and see how it works out, and then adjust it for 3 or 4 years until you get it dialed in so that you can expand. Because let's say that you go in there to your cornfield, and when the corn is tasseled, you fly an airplane over it and you drop seeds, a cover crop seed, at tassel time. And so you could totally do that, hire an airplane, he could drop your cover crop seeds in there, or you could have like a highboy sprayer that was modified to be like a seeder, and you could drive through the field and you could seed it that way. There could be other methods, I don't know, but those are 2 methods that certainly would work. And you plant the cover crop seed. When you go in there to harvest the corn, you will probably be driving on seed. I mean, depending on exactly when you harvest it. If you're chopping up for silage, it's going to be about, you have enough time to grow a lot of those cover crop seeds to be 4 inches tall if you plant at the right time. And that's what you want. You want to get your cover crops up and established, and so you're driving on it. Now, here's the reason you need to do a test strip. Because let's say you do a test strip and you find that the cover crop, because it's growing there, maybe it caused the soil to be too wet. And so as you go through with your chopper, and you're going through with your semi, your chopper, you're making your silage, and the ground's too wet, it would have been a tragedy had you done a whole bunch of those pivots and you did them all that way, and now you have a disaster on your hand because the ground's not drying out and you're not going to be able to cut your corn when you wanted to. That'd be a horrible nightmare. So that's why we do test strips. On the other hand, there could be something you could do. Maybe with the cover crop growing, maybe you can cut your irrigation off a little bit sooner. That's a possibility, because some people, the first thing we think is, well, if we have the irrigation going, then and we have a cover crop growing, it's going to use more water, so we need to put more irrigation on it. But that is not necessarily true. In some of the tests I've seen around the country, we're finding that with a cover crop growing, we're getting less evaporation from the ground, and so it's holding the water longer. But we don't know your soils there in Burrell. We don't know exactly how it's going to work out. So that's why we have to do test strips when we first start out. And then you could tweak it. You could tweak your irrigation when you're irrigating. You still want that corn quality to get up there. But once your corn is tasseled, planting a cover crop seed, that's not going to hurt your yields on your corn. Now, maybe it could. Therefore, that's why we do a small test strip here again. And you need 3 or 4 years of testing and tweaking things each year until you dial it in so that you're still getting a great harvest, and you are getting the benefit of the cover crop. So absolutely, your cover crop will help to stop the the compaction of the soil, and it's going to take 3 or 4 years to get that soil quality to where you want it. But it's going to be great to do that. And when you plant the cover crop mix, you could do maybe 3 or 4 different small test strips with different kinds of seeds. But I always recommend that a cover crop has at least 4 different species in it. So you could do like a triticale, a daikon radish, hairy vetch, and what are you doing with the fields afterwards? Because if you're grazing cattle afterwards, after you chop the corn, you probably don't want the hairy vetch in there. Sometimes it can be toxic to cattle. So you need to be really careful on what you're planting. You got to do your research. But just to simply answer your question, yes, your cover crops are going to help that soil very much. And I would go to a no-till system where you have a roller crimper and you're crimping down the cover crop in the springtime to go in and replant your next crop. So, I mean, I've driven through the Burrell Enterprise area quite a bit. I mean, they used to rotate potatoes down there, but I don't know if anybody's growing potatoes anymore. But whatever the rotations are with the corn, you might be able to fit in a super good no-till and cover crop system where you have excellent soil health. The biggest benefit to the soil health plan, if you get a good plan going, in 5 to 7 years, you're probably going to reduce 100% of your fertilizer costs, which would be awesome because corn takes a lot of fertilizer, and fertilizer is super expensive right now. So hopefully that helps. Thanks for the question. Great question. Do we have any more questions tonight?
What was a crimper? What's a crimper?
Oh, a roller crimper. So that's a machine that goes through the field, and instead of chopping or cutting the plants, it rolls down the plant. So think of a tire on a car or a truck. As it goes across your lawn, it's going to push down the grass. But a roller crimper is like a tire, except it's really wide. So these things come in like 20-foot wide or 30 feet wide, really big. And they have a blade on them every 4 inches, but it's a dull blade. So it doesn't cut the crops. It just crimps the crop. And if any of you are familiar with cutting hay, if you have like a hay bine and like on a swather, there's a crimper in it that will crush the foliage as it comes through when you're cutting hay, and it helps all of the moisture come out of it. So yes, the roller crimper terminates the crop, so it will kill it, and then you plant immediately behind it, and that works. In the early days of meaning 10, 15 years ago of learning how to do this, people were just going in and spraying it with Roundup to terminate the crop, and then they would plant in it. But recently we've found that we can save that cost too. And that helps so that your soil microbes are not dying, because the Roundup can kill some of the soil microbes that help to do the mineralizing of the soil so that you don't need to buy fertilizer. So it's a really great thing. We're cutting out a lot of costs. And even though we're not making any more money on selling the crop, we are saving a ton of money on inputs. And so it's making us a lot of money.
So you said that something about fertilizer with corn. So maybe you don't.
Yeah, corn. Yeah, go ahead, John.
So maybe you don't want to grow corn because you were going to require fertilizer. Can't use.
Oh, you want to grow corn in your garden for sure. Just do it the way I've taught you in these classes. You're going to need to add some fertilizer to it. But if you have your detritosphere on top, then, and you've got your soil health working so that you have a good agrotosphere, detritosphere, porosphere, and the rhizosphere is feeding those microbes. You've got a lot of earthworms, so you have your drillosphere. Then your soil is going to be functioning and it's going to feed that corn. And if you do need to give it a little bit more food in your garden, you can just run to Walmart or Lowe's, anywhere that has a garden center, and you buy a gallon jug of some like fish fertilizer, like fish emulsion or a fish hydrolysate, and you mix up a tablespoon of that in a gallon of water, and you pour it on your corn, like a half a cup on each hill of corn. And then
Sure.
that's going to be enough fertilizer, and that's going to be feeding your. So for a home garden, that's good. But see, after fertilizing for 2 or 3 years, you don't have to fertilize anymore. But if you stop fertilizing the first year, your soil is not functioning yet. And so you have to go through this process of building up these spheres in the soil. So,
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Right, it does. And so we've finished our flattening our surface on our hill where we're going to the terrace. We're going to put garden. It's about 30 feet by 65 or so. And we are going to, I think, like Ezekiel has talked about, we're going to try to get enough leaves to put down first, but I don't think we're going to find enough. But we're going to get wood chips then as a top layer, and that would, and 2 or 3 inches thick. Is that what would you recommend?
Yeah, that sounds good. It's always good to cover your soil because that, it protects it from wind erosion. It protects it from extreme soil. I mean, temperature fluctuations. It feeds the microbes in the soil that are going to mineralize and create the fertilizer for your plants. Yeah. So what you're doing is right. Put down and it doesn't really matter how you do it. You can go thin, you can go thick, but you do want your leaves underneath the wood chips, or else the leaves will just blow away.
Okay, and so the wood chips are probably not going to decay enough to by spring.
No, you don't want them to decay. That's one of the beautiful things about wood chips. You put them on there, they're going to be there for 8 or 9 years. That's a good thing. Just make sure you're not tilling them in.
Right,
If you
okay.
till them in, they start decomposing through a different process, and it causes a leach of nitrogen. But as long as they're on top of the soil, it doesn't do that, and you can grow really great plants. But what's happening is those wood chips are going to feed your fungal component of their soil microbes, and then those microbes are going to be taking nutrients and moisture to your plant's roots.
So are you going to have to move any of the wood chips in order to?
No. You put them down once and you leave them there forever. In fact, if you started with 3 inches of wood chips the first year, you would want to add an inch every year for the rest of your life.
And how do you get out? So you don't add any other other than the decaying of plants that we have from the previous year. I guess that's the only thing that you're really adding then to the soil, other than.
Yeah, see, and it all goes by how your plants are doing. Because let's just say this first year you put it out there and you put a bunch of transplants in, there's a good chance those transplants are not going to grow at all, because they need food, they need fertilizer. So that's where the fish emulsion comes in from the store. So for the first 2 or 3 years, you're going to be adding in that fertilizer, and there's a lot of other fertilizer sources you can do too. I just say that one because it's an easy one for people to get. And so, but so you're going to need to fertilize for maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years. But after that, your soil will get to a point where you have enough biology in the soil that you don't need fertilizer ever again. And this is true for big agriculture, and this is true for small gardens. It's true for any plant you grow. And there's millions of American farm acres that are proving it works on the big agricultural scale.
Okay, and so I'm just trying to be clear here. So how are we going to build the nutrients in the soil? It's not going to come from this entirely from these wood chips. We're going to get it from the dead plants that we leave, the roots, the other things that we're going to leave in the ground.
Yeah. So let me just remind you, The microbes in the soil, those are the little guys who are going to make the nutrients. The microbes make the nutrients, but you have to feed the microbes so that they stay alive. And the microbes have two food sources. One is your dead organic matter on top of the soil, which is your leaves and your wood chips. Your second food source is the exudates that comes out of the living plant roots. So you'll always want to have a living plant root in the soil if possible. And so that's how you feed the microbes. Now, since the microbes are alive because you're feeding them, the microbes do a process called mineralization. And mineralization is when they take the sands, the silts, and the clays that are deep down in the ground, and they will turn those into all of the elements into a soluble form so that your plants can absorb them. In the soil world, we call that availability. So they will make the boron and the zinc and the molybdenum and the copper and the sulfur. They will make it available for the plants to absorb. So there's every soil on earth. You should never say 100%, but pretty much every soil on earth has all the nutrients that any plant needs to grow. It's just that they're not available. And so when we feed the microbes enough food, then we start growing enough microbes, both in enough, meaning enough mass of one species and enough diversity of thousands of species of these microbes. Then they start doing enough mineralization, and they will attach to all the plant's roots that we're trying to grow, because the plants are feeding them, and they will trade the sugars that are coming out of the plant roots for these minerals that the plants require. I mean, I've got pictures of alfalfa leaves that are the size of a quarter in a lot of agricultural fields, and people don't even know it's alfalfa because many alfalfa growers today, that we don't really know what a healthy alfalfa looks like because we're growing alfalfa and it grows good. And so we think it's growing good. Like it'll get, 2.5 feet high. It's beautiful. And we get high yields off of our fields. We're getting plenty of tonnage off of our acreage. And we're sending it to market, and we're getting 6 cuttings or 8 cuttings a year, depending on where you live. And so we think that it's healthy because we're getting a lot of a volume, but the plants are not actually healthy because the plants should be round, and they shouldn't have those little spikes coming out of them, and they should be big, like the size of a quarter. Not perfectly round, they are oblong shaped, but what I mean by round is the edges should be crisp and clean. They shouldn't have that jaggedy edge that we see on almost all alfalfa. The reason we're seeing that is because there's too much salts in the soil from the fertilizers that we're putting on. And yet we're getting good tonnage. But when we do sap analysis tests, a lot of times we are finding in those alfalfa fields that they're actually deficient in quite a few things, even though it's making good feed for livestock.
Well,
So
it still makes good feed, even if it's not developed properly.
Well, that depends. I mean, we say it makes good feed because we have a lot of it, and the cattle fatten up on it really good. And so, yeah, I mean, by that standard, yes, it's good feed. But here again, any good livestock manager knows that you have to give mineral to your livestock. Well, when you're feeding livestock from the kind of alfalfa I'm talking about, they won't even go to the bin and eat the free choice mineral.
Right.
We've seen herds of cattle doing that across the United States. And yet the universities are still teaching what they've been teaching for 50 years. And it's so hard to get academia to come up to the new science.
Well, the same true, I'm sure, with genetically modified organisms, too, that cattle will choose the organic as opposed to the GMO grains and corn or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Have you read an article saying that? I don't know if I've.
Yeah. I've read several that say that they
That's
actually make that choice. They can recognize what is good.
Yeah, that'd be
Good.
neat. Send me some links to those articles. That's interesting. I've never done research on that part of it.
Right. Okay.
It's fascinating.
Okay.
So anyway, are there any more questions from our live people here tonight? I do have a couple of questions from that people sent me some questions online, so I think I'll go to those right now and I'll just talk about them because I have quite a few people who listen to this later. And so here's the questions. So the first question I got, are willow trees good for chipping and turning into compost? The answer is yes, absolutely. Willows are a really good tree to make compost out of. I like willow. I really like cottonwood. I like anything in the poplar family. The poplars are super good for chipping. And I've heard hog farmers say that if you chip it up and put pigs in there, they'll eat a lot of it. I don't know if that's true, but it's fascinating. So the second question I got online. I have peas, daikon radish, hairy vetch, and cereal rye seed that you recommended for a cover crop inside my greenhouse. When should I plant it, now or later? So it depends on your climate, where you are. I do recommend this as a good cover crop for greenhouses throughout the winter. I would plant it in the fall, say October would be a good time to plant this. But if you plant it right now, because we're December, January, the coldest time of year, if you have a greenhouse that freezes at night, don't plant it. Wait till the 1st of February when we're getting more warm days. And then it'll get off to a little bit better start. Okay, so the next question. Why are you watering with a water wand in your Patreon videos? Aren't you watering with your drip system? Or why aren't you watering? So that is a good question because I made some videos. It's on my Patreon page. One of my people who watches that, one of my subscribers, asked this question. And it's because if I turn on my drip system, it waters the entire greenhouse. But in the wintertime, I don't want the entire greenhouse to be wet. I obviously want it to be moist so that plants continue to grow and so that the microbes stay healthy and happy and the earthworms are happy. But I don't want everything to get super saturated. So when I transplant new plants, I'll go out there with my dibble. I'll poke a bunch of holes in the ground, and then I'll get my little transplants of spinach, kale, green onions, lettuce. Those are the types of things I plant in the winter. In fact, I planted a whole bunch this week. And so I just poke those in the holes, and then I'll just bring my hose with my watering wand. And that's the only section where I water, because those need to be watered in so that they get good contact. So the roots get good contact with the soil. And so that's why I use the watering wand, just to spot water specific areas that need to be a little bit more moist. Okay, the last question that I got online this week. How would you respond to a farmer who says that tilling and disking his fields helps to decompress the soil? I would respond by saying that this person does not understand the latest science, the newest science about soil health and how to actually create a really good functioning soil. They're still doing it the old way, the way we've done it for 100 years, which is okay, except they're going to have to be spending a lot of money to fight weeds. They're going to be spending a lot of money on pesticides and fertilizers, and they're going to be driving through their fields a lot more times, so they'll be burning a lot more fuel, and if they're paying people, they'll be putting out a lot more money in labor costs. But with the new way, we can go through our fields twice a year, once to plant and to roll down our cover crop. So that's one pass, because our roller goes through and it crimps the cover crop, and we plant at the same time. So we pull both implements together with our tractor. And then the second pass would be at the end of the year when you harvest. You go through and you harvest. And when you're going through harvesting, you would have a seeder on the back of your combine and you would scatter seed at that time. And like I mentioned earlier to one of the questions tonight, you may have a third pass if you're going to plant during the growing season with an airplane or with a different type of planter. So you may have 3 passes. You may even have 4 passes if you need to do something else. But some people in agriculture are going through their fields 5, 7, 8 times a year to grow one crop. And that is just too much money that's being spent compared to the bottom line of how much we get from commodity crops when we're harvesting. Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If there's anybody live on here who wants to ask another one, let me check my chat and see if I have another question. Okay, no more questions in the chat. So now's your moment. If you have another question, go ahead and ask. Okay, it has been fun tonight. Thank you for being on. And I'll just remind you that I will be on every Thursday night. The only time I'm not on Thursday night is if there's a major holiday like Thanksgiving or a Christmas is on a Thursday, or if I have a bad internet connection, because I do live in the mountains of rural Nevada, and sometimes we have internet problems. That's just the way it is. I still think it's worth doing it. So if you try to get on and I'm not here, that's why. And that has happened, I think, 3 times in the last year. But thanks for being on tonight. Remember, our boot camp is coming up. And if you have any other questions about how I can help you grow food, go to georgiarevolution.com and check out my website. I am going to close this out for the night and have a great week. See you next week.
Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
Okay, would you go down and tell Kaylin